and happy Wednesday. It's time for coffee and conversation with Jennifer, Simplicity Coach. And I want to remind you that organizing isn't complicated, time is sacred, and money is a renewable resource. So this week's topic really stems from a conversation that I was having yesterday with my neighbor. And my neighbor is 71, I believe, and we were talking about some of her friends who haven't gotten things in order or prepared for when they'll pass away. And I understand why a lot of people don't want to do that because it's not very uplifting and it's a little depressing. But we started talking about a couple of her friends who have said things in the past like, well, I'm just not going to think about it. Just not going to think about it. Or, well, I won't have to worry about it because I won't be here. I won't have to worry about it because I won't be here. So when we're talking about when the time comes and your money and your things and your home and your desires and your thoughts and wishes, if those things aren't written down and the stories aren't told about your things, then when you pass away, it's very overwhelming for a family. And I can speak to this specifically from the estate sale side of our business. When someone passes away, emotions are really high, and there's this desire to want to go down memory lane. So that we want to look at photos, we want to talk about the fun times and the funny times and the stories, and we want to separate furniture and move things around that meant something to the family member that passed away. But when none of that is taken care of in advance, i.e. legacy, when it's not left, then you're really leaving a huge burden, or a person is leaving a huge burden to their family. So we spend our entire lives living in homes, getting things, acquiring things, collecting things. I don't collect stuff, but I know plenty of people do. And buying things and having things and going places, and there's stories about our things. Oh, that was my great grandma's. In particular, a couple of summers ago, I think I totaled it up. It was about 24 hours with my grandparents, really writing their legacy. And it was this is something I'm really passionate about, because our greatest asset is our memory, and our greatest asset is our family's history and our family's story. So when someone passes away, it's such a burden lifter when, one, photos have been organized, two, if there were pieces of furniture that were special to that family member that passed away, if that is written down with the story, the funny parts, the hard parts, like, oh, the leg broke and we had to pay $300 to get it fixed, or whatever the story might be, that's where families can really unite in a time that's really overwhelming and exhausting. But a lot of times families start to really get divided and get very defensive with one another when they should be uniting. And the reason that happens usually is because goals aren't united, and it's hard to know what to do if a parent, for example, didn't leave any instructions. So we see this with estate sales sometimes, not all the time. But if there are multiple children, or maybe like one kid and a couple of grandkids, but not everyone is on the same page about the stuff, then they can get really hung up on that. Some folks think that stuff's worth a lot of money, and that really is because that's what we were told and sold back in the 40s and 50s, that stuff was going to be investment pieces. People weren't really putting a lot of money in the stock market. They were buying furniture and antiques, and they were told that these were going to be investments. So buy this now and leave a legacy for your family, and they'll be set up and ready to go. And it just wasn't true, because it was marketing and everyone bought into it. So there's just an abundance of stuff in our world now. But when the goals aren't united, so let's say, for example, we'll just use my grandparents as an example because they're still living. their photos are organized because I went through them. I wrote down the notes on the back as to, you know, who this was or where this was. My grandpa was in the Army, so there was a lot of photos of different places where they lived. So that's taken care of. They had 3 children. My dad is the oldest, and then he had 2 brothers. So any photos that were just of that child, we separated them out and then passed them on to the adult kids now. I mean, my dad's 60-something, so my grandparents don't need to keep that. We don't need to wait until they've passed away for my dad and his brothers to have those photos. So those were taken care of. Then we went through their home, and any piece of furniture that was really important to them or had kind of a fun story, I wrote it down. I took a picture of it and I wrote it down. I did the same thing with their jewelry. My grandmother's engagement ring was not these big flashy rocks that you see on ladies' hands nowadays, but it was this little gumball looking machine ring, and it will have no market value, but it will have significant memory value. And I wanted to make sure that I captured that. So I wrote that down. I took pictures again of the jewelry, and this was, you know, Mama's engagement ring, and Papa gave it to her at so-and-so space, and blah, blah, blah. That's legacy. Once that stuff is taken care of, then no one really cares too much about what happens with the kitchen supplies or the tools or whatever that might be. And so it's really easy to close an estate, to move on, to move through the one step of the process is, what do I do with this stuff? And then 2, what do we do with the home or the property? And then 3, closing the estate and kind of moving on with the memories. And by not taking that into consideration and not having that conversation, and I'll tell you, it was a little uncomfortable having that conversation with my grandparents. They were fine with the photos. They were semi-okay with the furniture, but when I started asking about the jewelry, they got really weird. And I could just be perceiving that, but that was something that they were like, well, I don't really know if this matters. And I said, well, this will matter for us girls. We don't care so much about the hall coat rack or the acrylic quilt that great-grandma made, but for the jewelry, it matters just as much, the story. Otherwise, it ends up in pawn shops or ends up in the Habitat Restore. Maybe not the jewelry, but the furniture. And so the story behind legacy is really what makes that kind of time, when the time comes, it makes it not so unbearable. And there is a really great way to respectfully end and close an estate and send those things off to find new homes and to find new owners. And part of that is hiring a liquidator or a liquidation company to help with that process. One of the respectful ways is how it's set up, how it's marketed, and how it's priced. And this is not a plug for our business, but it is a call for families to do some research and do some homework whenever you are in that situation with an aunt or a loved one, a mom or a grandma or a sister or whoever may have passed, and you're standing around going, what in the world are we going to do with all their stuff? And man, I don't even know what they like. What did they really like? What were they attached to? What meant something to them? What did they think was worth money? And that is where the overwhelm starts. And so from that space, you're already kind of on the defense. And then you start asking questions or reaching out to liquidators. And as an industry, it's not highly regulated. If you're an auctioneer, you have to have a license. So it's far more regulated than an estate liquidator, where everything's just priced. So that's kind of the difference. An auction is, you know, better do, I don't even know how to do it, but you do need to have a license to be an auctioneer. But if you're just going to have an estate sale, you don't need any special license or training to do so. So it opens the door for a lot of folks to come in and offer the service. Again, it's a great service, but some people don't do it in the most respectful way. And so what we found with our own business, the best way to provide peace of mind and to provide some relief from the overwhelm is, one, have the conversation early. Talk about legacy, talk about the story, focus on the good, don't focus on, well, when you pass away, I want to have all this stuff written down. Just focus on their life story. And I have found that most older people really enjoy telling their story, and I really enjoy listening to it. especially if it's someone that I know, and write that stuff down. Spend some time now. It's going to take an investment now, but that will pay off dividends when that person has passed away. And then when they do, really think about what is the most respectful way that I can send this stuff off. And it's easier to know how to do that when you've already had the questions answered, when you've already asked the questions and you've already gone through some work with them. And it takes away this fear of, am I giving something away that was worth a lot of money? Or it keeps you from hoarding things that you thought were worth a lot of money that weren't actually worth that much. And it really keeps siblings and family members from fighting. And it keeps them united on a time when they should be. So it's becoming summer for, well, it's not becoming summer, it's almost summer. But for the estate business, it's usually our busy time because folks are moving and they're downsizing, and it's a good time for real estate. So it tends to be also a good time for estate sales. But we just noticed some upticks in conversations with families who are dealing with this. And given the conversation that I had with my neighbor whose friend said, well, I don't have to worry about it. Well, that's really mean. And while no, you won't be here physically and you won't have to worry about it, it's really mean to make your family deal with that. And since we think stuff's worth a lot, it's just, I don't know, right. It just seems right to have that conversation with your family. And also, let me add that there's two different values with items. There's memory value and there's market value. Sometimes an item has more memory value than it does market value. And in that case, I recommend families keep it. And sometimes things have market value because they're trendy, but it's Pyrex, for example, it's highly collectible, but it's not always highly profitable, if that makes sense. Like, it could be really desirable, but you're not going to get a whole lot for it. You'll sell it, but you're going to sell it for the market value. And there's a huge, there's just a lot of fear, I think, around how much stuff is worth, and am I giving it away? Am I losing money? I remember the money was spent when you bought it, and when your family member, your mom, your grandma, your whatever bought it, that money was spent. So whatever you get for it now is, if it's higher or lower, it doesn't matter. It's a gamble anyways. We don't buy things. Stuff is not investment pieces. Stuff is bought and it's made and it's meant to be used. And if it just so happens to be worth more later, awesome. But either way, we really should start looking at things a little bit more objectively and looking at the things that matter the most to us. Memories, photos, and time together. So that's this week's conversation. If you have any questions, as always, you can pop them down below. Otherwise, you can catch me next week for Coffee and Convo with Jennifer at 3. And in the meantime, have a great week.